Welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video, Anatomy of an Arms Race. This is a version of a talk that I got to give for a national webinar about the current state and the future of the residency selection process. My job specifically was to discuss the challenges associated with the current residency application process. Now, the focus of the webinar was really to think about how COVID-19 had impacted the residency selection process. But I really wanted to use my time to get the audience to think bigger. And so I started here. If you didn't recognize him already, this is a picture of Jesse Owens. He's maybe the greatest athlete in track and field history. At the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Owens won gold medals in the long jump, the 100 meters, the 200 meters, and the 4x100 relay. Of course, the 1936 Olympics were held in Berlin, so Owens' victories weren't just athletic feats. Each gold medal was incredibly symbolic because it served to crush Adolf Hitler's notion of white supremacy. When Owens ran the 100-meter dash, he was just zero point 0.1 seconds off the world record, which was, of course, a record that he'd set himself just 2 months before. 100-meter dash, it was not exactly a close race. Owens was clearly ahead of the pack after just 30 meters, and by the time that he crossed the finish line, the nearest German was still zero point 0.4 seconds behind him, which at this distance is an eternity. But here's the thing. Owens ran the 100-meter dash in 10.3 seconds. To put that in perspective, at the 2012 Olympics, Usain Bolt won with a time of 9.63 seconds. And yet, Jesse Owens, he's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, track athletes who has ever lived. And if he came back today and he duplicated his world record shattering runs from the 1930s, he wouldn't even make the US Olympic team. It goes to show just how much has changed over the years. And you know, I hear this thing a lot from physicians when they talk about residency selection. Oh, these applicants today, they're so much better than I was. If I applied today, I'd be lucky to even match. And at this point, everybody who's listening usually politely chuckles at this kind of self-deprecating humor. And it's true, residency selection is a different ballgame than it used to be even just a few years ago. But I think if you pick at this just a little bit and you scratch below the surface, what you'll see isn't actually that funny. I think what you're going to find is actually quite troubling and deserving of careful consideration, because left unaddressed, it threatens the future of medical education and the well-being of the future physician workforce and our patients. Here's the heart of the issue. What I'm showing you here is a graphic that will be familiar to many of you. It's from the NRMP's main residency match report, and they update it every year. It shows the number of match applicants, that's the green curve, as well as the number of residency positions available in the match, and that's the purple curve. And what you can see is if you go back to the beginning of the match in the 1950s, there were more positions available than there were applicants. Hospitals used to have to compete for residents, and many hospitals actually went home in that competition empty-handed. This, of course, was the cause of the early and exploding offers that necessitated the formation of the match in the first place. But what you'll see is that by the 1960s and 70s, there was a steep upward trend in the number of applicants. And after some fluctuations through the 80s, by the early 1990s, we've consistently had a situation where the number of applicants has consistently outpaced the number of positions available. And what that means is that the situation is now reversed. Instead of hospitals going home empty-handed on match day, it's a certain number of applicants. Now, don't get me wrong, overall match rates are good. For graduating U.S. medical students, the typical match rate is around 93 or 94%. And even this year, amidst all the chaos caused by COVID-19, the match rate for U.S. seniors was still 92.8%. For graduating osteopathic medical students, 89.1% matched this year. And obviously, the residency placement rate is much higher because many of these applicants that don't match at first, they ultimately find a position in the SOAP. But my point here is that there's scarcity. And this graphic really just addresses that scarcity on the most macroscopic level because there's also scarcity in the nature of the positions available or their geographic location or any other variable that impacts their desirability to applicants. When there's scarcity, there's going to be competition. And applicants today are competing ever more intensely to obtain a scarce resource. They're competing with each other in the number of applications that they submit. Because if you hold all other things constant, An applicant who submits more applications gains an advantage over an otherwise identical applicant who submits fewer. This, of course, is what fuels the phenomenon that I like to call application fever, and that's what I'm showing you on this slide. Back in 2007, when I graduated from medical school, the average U.S. medical student submitted just 31 residency applications. By 2020, that figure had increased to 70 applications. And, international medical graduates submit even more, a mean of 139 apiece in 2020. And again, that figure is up substantially from just a decade ago. This kind of over-application is expensive. I mean, submitting this many applications costs thousands of dollars, and yet, in the aggregate, over-application doesn't benefit applicants. Match rates are unchanged. Put another way, applicants are paying more and more and more to achieve the same outcome that they collectively did in the past. And over-application doesn't benefit program directors either. The average program gets 100 applications for every position that they're trying to fill, and some get many more than that. Program directors need more applications like they need a hole in the head. And this deluge of applications leaves many of them buried so deep in applications that the only way to dig out is by using convenience metrics to screen applications and thin the pile to an amount that a regular human being can actually read. Maybe the most convenient of all the convenience metrics that you can use to thin applications is a USMLE score filter. So as more and more residency programs began to use these filters, applicants began to compete more and more for a high score. What I'm showing you here is how the average USMLE Step 1 score has risen over time. In 1992, when the USMLE was started, the average score was 200. By 2018, which is the last date shown on this graph, the mean score had risen to 230, and actually in 2019, it was 232. Now here, it's important to realize that the USMLE score reporting scale hasn't changed. The score does not get recentered like some norm reference tests like the SAT. Students score higher today because they're honest to God answering more questions correctly than students did even just a few years ago. The effects of this are pretty dramatic. Like I said, the average performance, the center of the bell curve, has shifted by more than 1.5 standard deviations from where it started. What that means is that if you took USMLE Step 1 in 1992 or 1993 and you scored a 226, you were in the 90th percentile and the world was your oyster. Nowadays, a student that scores a 226 is actually below average. If you scored a 200 back in 1994, that was right at the mean. Perfectly respectable score. Nowadays, you get a 200, you're in the 9th percentile, and your advisor is going to have a talk with you about being realistic about your career options. And the rise in USMLE Step 2 CK scores is even more dramatic. Nowadays, the average US first-time test taker scores a 244. That figure would have placed them in the 98th percentile if they took the test 30 years ago. But again, what's important to recognize is that in terms of absolute medical knowledge, an applicant who scores a 200 today is identical to an applicant who scored a 200 in 1993. If absolute medical knowledge was actually what we cared about, then within the limitations of the measurement, both of these applicants possess just as much of it and they're equally prepared for residency training. Now, when you realize that, it's fascinating to think about how many physicians who graduated 30 years ago have gone on to complete a residency, gainfully practice medicine, serve their patients, serve their communities, contribute to research and scholarship, work as program directors, lead academic departments and institutions, all while seemingly unencumbered by the fact that they entered residency with less medical knowledge than applicants do today. Of course, it's not just standardized test scores where applicants compete, it's everything else in the application too. This graphic is from the 2018 NRMP's Charting Outcomes in the Match Report for U.S. seniors. It shows the mean number of research items, that is, abstracts, presentations, and publications, by the specialty that each applicant preferred, that is, the specialty they ranked first. And within each specialty, there's a blue bar to show the average for students who actually were successful in matching into that specialty, and a green bar to show the number for people who weren't. So as you can see in highly competitive specialties like neurosurgery, the average successfully matched candidate in 2018 had 13.4 research items. Even applicants that didn't match in neurosurgery still had 8.4 research items. Now, those are impressive figures. But what's even more impressive is to know how those figures have changed over time. Go back to the 2011 Charting Outcomes in the Match Report. And the average successful neurosurgery applicant listed 7.4 abstracts, presentations, and publications. 7.4. That means that the average unmatched neurosurgery applicant today has more research than the average matched applicant did less than a decade ago. And I'm not just cherry picking numbers here. This same phenomenon applies to many other specialties too. The average applicant in anesthesiology, emergency medicine, internal medicine, psychiatry, back in 2011, they all had fewer than 2 abstracts, publications, and presentations. Now, even the unmatched applicants in those specialties best those figures. Here's one more battlefield and then I'll stop. Away rotations. This is a fun one. Here's a table with data from a survey that was conducted through ERIS about how many away rotations applicants completed. Specialties are listed down through here, and this column shows the percentage of students then in that specialty who did at least one away rotation, a visiting rotation done outside of their home institution. Now look at these figures. You can see that in competitive specialties like orthopedic surgery, 98% of students are doing away rotations, and on average, they're doing 2 of them. You might wonder how these figures compare to the past. I did, but historical data on how many away rotations students used to do are actually hard to come by, presumably because students were doing them so infrequently that it never became a focus of serious academic inquiry. And it's easy to understand why students want to do these visiting electives. It's because program directors want them to. Look at this column that shows the fraction of the respondents in the survey who ended up matching at an institution where they had done an away rotation. You can see in many competitive specialties that fraction is 40% or higher. And here again, we've got to realize that this trend is not without cost. It's expensive and it's logistically burdensome to do these away rotations. And giving preference to applicants who complete more of them systematically disadvantages applicants who have lesser financial means or less willingness to incur debt. It also disadvantages applicants who may have children or families that they don't want to pack up and leave for months out of the year. So what's the point? Where am I going with all this? This is the part of the talk where I really want you to think, because there can be a belief that competition is always a good thing. Competition forces competitors to do their best, to be better. Think about track and field. I mean, the fastest runners in the world now, they run a lot faster than Jesse Owens. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, if you like to see fast runners, that's a good thing. Or, when Hollywood studios compete to win Oscars, we all win because we get to watch better movies. Or when Samsung and Apple try to win the market for cell phones, we all end up with a better phone in our pocket. So in many areas, competition is certainly a good thing. And at first glance, I mean, isn't that what I'm showing you on these previous slides? I mean, who wouldn't want their doctor to have more medical knowledge? I mean, maybe these higher step 1 scores, they're a good thing. I mean, research is a great thing. Who doesn't want more of it? But this is where things start to break down. By almost any measurable standard, today's medical students are better than those from previous eras. But how many people actually believe that? The funny thing is, some of the very people who joke about how they never get into medical school today, you can also catch those people complaining about how today's medical students aren't up to snuff, that they don't have the insight, they don't have the drive, they don't have the compassion, they don't have the moxie that students did back in the day. Now, it'd be easy to look at comments like that and say, ha ha ha, you're a hypocrite. But there's something more there. There's something more there. If students today are doing so much more, and it's objectively true that they are, why isn't there universal acknowledgement and celebration that we're in this golden era of medical training? Things have never been better. Our students have never been better. The answer, I think, is that there's an important distinction to be made between a competition that produces a social good, a virtuous competition, and an arms race in which the competitors wastefully invest more and more resources just to maintain a relative advantage. Arms races hurt the competitors. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had enough nuclear arms to blow up every city and strategic target in the United States 3 times over. They didn't need that many nuclear bombs. I mean, I think nuking each of us just once would have been sufficient. The reason they needed to have 3 bombs for every city was because we had 3 bombs for every Soviet city. And as they poured more and more money and more resources into their military, it came at the expense of other things. And that, of course, is one reason among many that the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, does that remind you of anything? The only reason an applicant needs to have a 250 on step one now is because the average applicant's pulling a 230. The only reason you need to apply to 100 residency programs is because everyone else is applying to 70. It doesn't matter what it is, you just need more of it. In an arms race, competitors can only benefit relative to each other. There's no more benefit to society at large. The increased inputs from the competitors benefit only them, but the competition itself doesn't yield any more benefits to society. Now, in my opinion, the ultimate product of medical education should be capable, compassionate healers. And the ultimate product of our residency selection system should be the efficient allocation of doctors to training programs in a way that not only optimizes the preferences of the programs and applicants, but also maximizes the benefit to society at large of having a well-matched workforce. So I ask, do our current systems hit those marks? Are we producing the products that we want? I say no. I think we're in a moment now where we should reflect seriously on our incentive systems. There's an aphorism in education that assessment drives learning. The idea is that what you choose to test is exactly what students are going to aspire to learn. But there's a special corollary of that in medical education, which is that program directors' priorities drive student priorities. If a PD says jump, students say how high. And we have a powerful lever there if we choose to use it to drive the kind of changes that we might want to see. We should think about how we can align the goals of medical education with residency selection so that the competition that results is a virtuous one and it creates more of the goods that we want instead of just senselessly burning out its competitors. And at this point, I turn over the talk to the other speakers. So thanks for listening to my words here.